Barbados, 1816. The cane fields looked gentle from a distance, a green ocean waving at the sky. Up close, the blades cut skin and pride in the same stroke. Sweetness here was measured in scars. Day began before light. Men and women filed out with machetes, their breath visible in heat that never cooled. A bell rang at the mill, and time belonged to someone else. They called sugar white gold, a fortune that never reached the hands that harvested it. A ledger in the big house turned lives into numbers. On the line where names should be, someone wrote, "Stock." The mill's gears didn't stop, only paused to swallow another cart. Juice ran like a pale river, then darkened in the cauldrons. Workers learned to move without thinking, or thinking without moving. Children worked close to the press, small bodies fitting where grown ones could not. They fed the rollers with cane and their fear. Everyone knew a name the press had taken. The overseer's horse cast the longest shadow. His whistle cut the air sharper than any blade. He never touched sugar, only people. At noon, the sun turned the fields into a mirror. Backs bent, hands blistered, salt stung the fresh cuts so they would not forget. Water was rationed like forgiveness. Rum made its round at dusk. One tin cup, too thin to numb, too warm to comfort. It kept the night quiet enough to keep the mill's promise: work again tomorrow. Quiet was the cheapest tool on the island. In the great house, polished floors reflected chandeliers and maps. Letters from London praised efficiency. No one wrote about the smell that clung to the boiling house, sweet, metallic, final. Sundays were for God, but rest was brief and borrowed. The sermon spoke of patience and reward. Outside, the cane hissed in the wind as if it had heard this speech before. Names crossed the Atlantic with their owners and were lost on arrival. New names arrived with ownership papers. The old ones survived in whispers traded behind the cauldrons. At night, the boiling house glowed like a furnace. Men stirred the syrup with paddles taller than themselves. One misstep and the sweetness climbed your skin and didn't let go. Silence had a rhythm. Bell, cane, press, boil, bell. It taught the body how to move even when the mind fled. The body always returned before dawn. A woman named Amara learned to count time by burns. She wrapped her arms in cloth and kept working. She did not pray loud. The boilers ate prayers for steam. They said the island's wealth was built on discipline. Discipline meant the lash tied to the overseer's saddle. No one spoke the word, but everyone understood its weight. Night brought the only tenderness Barbados allowed, a breeze through the cane, the smell of the sea beyond the fields. The sea was distance, not escape. Boats had oars and owners. News arrived with the ships, parliamentary debates, sugar prices, wars in far places. None of it changed the bell the next morning. The world was big, the island was small, the day was exact. Old men remembered a time before cane, and younger men called that a story. The mill had been here longer than any voice that questioned it. Memory dulled where the gears shined. Sometimes a cane knife slipped and drew a red line on a green stalk. The worker pressed cloth to the cut, then to the skin. Blood taught faster than schooling. A cart overturned once, syrup spilling into dirt. Children touched it and laughed at the stickiness. Their mothers pulled them away, saying the ground had eaten enough. Punishment days were quiet, even the birds stepping aside. The whip made a sound that everyone could draw with their eyes closed. The body learned which muscles not to flinch. On pay lists, there were wages for men who never touched a machete. For those who did, there were rations and rules. Hunger signed where wages should have been. Laughter survived in pockets. A joke about the overseer's hat, a song hummed off-key, a look shared at the mill door, small contraband against a large order. The big house held a piano shipped over water and consequence. Sometimes its keys floated across the fields. The notes sounded like rain to those who needed rain. In the barracks, night gathered with the smell of molasses and ash. Amara traced a line on the floor with her fingertip. It was the shape of a road no one could see yet. A ledger leaf blew from an open window one afternoon and stuck to the press. A boy peeled it off and read the totals as if they were scripture. He learned how much a life weighed. The island kept accounts. Cane to sugar, sugar to rum, rum to coin. No column tracked the hours of a back or the price of a hand. Balance arrived only at the warehouse. Work songs stayed low, a murmur beneath the gears. Words folded into rhythm where words were dangerous. Even a hum could carry a thought. Rain, when it came, turned the field paths into brown ropes. Bodies slid and rose and slid again. The mill didn't slow, water only cooled the iron. A visitor from another island asked the overseer how order was kept. "We keep the fire where we can see it," he said, pointing to the boiling house. He did not point at the people. At sunset, the cane leaves flashed silver, then black. Smoke from the chimneys laid a film on the sky. Night arrived, dressed in work clothes. Amara watched the steam rise, a white column straight into the dark. She pressed her palm against a warm brick and closed her eyes. The heat answered like a held breath. In the quiet that followed the bell, a small thought learned to stand. It did not shout, it took inventory. Sugar had a taste, a color, a weight. So did the hand that made it. The island slept in shifts. The mill did not sleep at all. Even dreams wore bandages. Morning waited just beyond the door. A moth flew too close to the boiling pan and vanished without ripple. Someone said, "It didn't know sugar burns." Someone else said, "It does now." The overseer wrote a report about losses, gains, acceptable casualties. He underlined acceptable twice. The ink dried while a woman's bandage bled through. Between the bell and the breath after it, there was a space. In that space, a worker adjusted a grip, another flexed fingers, another looked toward the horizon. Space was the only wealth shared equally. The day ended where it began, at the edge of the fields, facing a sky that owed no one. Amara wiped molasses from her wrist and tasted metal. Sweetness had teeth. Sugar made kings. The field made the kings possible. And under the field, a question turned over like a coal refusing to die. No one spoke of rebellion. People spoke of weather, of prices, of a cousin sold to a distant parish. The island knew how to keep a secret until it needed a witness. Night gathered its tools, wind, darkness, quiet feet. The mill groaned as if it could feel sleep approaching. The bell would call again, it always did. Before lying down, Amara dipped a rag into a bucket and washed her hands slow. The water turned the color of work. She watched it settle and did not look away. Somewhere beyond the cane, the sea pushed against rock and pulled away again. It repeated this lesson without words. To move was not the same as to run. In the barracks, a child asked why sugar hurt. A mother said, "Because someone else eats it." The child nodded, as if this answered more than one question. When the lamp went out, heat from the day stayed in the walls. Bodies shifted, seeking cooler boards. Sleep came in thin slices. One more day it ended without changing a single rule. The island took note, so did the ones who cut it. On the table beside Amara's bed, a stray sugar crystal caught moonlight and shone. She pressed it under her thumb until it broke. It felt like a promise, learning its first word. Morning rose without apology. The sky was white, not from clouds, but from smoke that never left. The mill wheel started turning before the roosters remembered to crow. The sound of iron teeth eating cane was the island's anthem. The men carried stalks to the crusher. Each thud was a heartbeat. Each crack of stalk became a prayer, crushed into syrup. No one spoke, because words could spoil the rhythm, and rhythm was the only thing that kept the pain in line. Amara tied a cloth around her head, tucked the ends behind her neck. The cloth was red once, now it was the color of labor, brown, gray, and salt. Steam rose from the boiling room like breath from an open wound. She stirred the vats, her reflection broken by bubbles. In the heat haze, shapes moved like ghosts. Kojo, the old stoker, leaned on his shovel, his eyes the same color as the coals. He said the fire had a memory. "It eats what we feed it, but never forgets the taste." He smiled, toothless, proud. One day it will remember who started it. A whip cracked outside. No one flinched anymore. The sound had become part of the day's weather. Amara dipped a ladle into the bubbling syrup, testing thickness. A drop burned her hand. She didn't hiss. The pain was an old dialect, fluent now. At the far end of the mill, the overseer's boots struck rhythm on the wooden boards. He carried a flask of rum, drinking between orders. "Rum keeps a man civil," he said once. No one told him it was made from the same sugar that killed civility. At noon, the heat folded time in half. The air shimmered, heavy with sweetness that turned the stomach. Someone fainted. The overseer said, "Lazy." They dragged the man to shade and poured rum on his lips. His mouth didn't move. The ants came first. Kojo whispered a story to Amara that evening while they cleaned the vats. Long ago, the sea refused to take any more bodies, so it sent back fire to finish the work. His laughter rasped like sandpaper. "When you hear the fire talk, you'll know it's come home." She didn't laugh. She had heard it already, a low murmur beneath the roar of the mill, like a song inside the flame. Sometimes it called her name, drawn out and soft, Amara. Night returned early, thick and red. The barracks smelled of ash and molasses. The men sat on overturned barrels, the women wrapped in silence. Rum passed from hand to hand, bitter as old blood. Someone tried to sing, but the tune fell apart. One man asked, "When does the sun sleep?" Kojo replied, "When the sugar stops boiling." They all smiled, the kind of smile that knows the joke and the truth are the same thing. Amara stared at her palms. The burns there had turned into white scars, lines like rivers. She rubbed them, feeling the edges rise. "The fire remembers," she whispered. No one answered, but heads turned, quick, cautious. Beyond the barracks, the fields glowed faintly from moonlight trapped in the cane. Every stalk looked like a candle that refused to go out. The island seemed peaceful, but peace had the smell of molasses, sweet, thick, and hiding smoke underneath. A rat scurried across the rafters. Someone threw a boot. The rat disappeared. Silence returned, unbothered. Outside, the ocean groaned, the same old sound of chains rattling beneath waves. Kojo tapped his tin cup 3 times on the floor, slow, deliberate. "3 for memory," he said, "3 for warning." The others listened, not knowing whether it was superstition or signal, maybe both. That night, Amara dreamed of her husband's last day. His hands blackened from syrup, his eyes open but unseeing. The fire had swallowed him whole, left nothing but steam. She woke with a start, the dream still burning behind her eyelids. Outside, she saw the boiling house from afar. The chimney breathed red against the sky. Every exhale looked like a message. Not yet. Not done. She picked up a lump of sugar from the floor, white and crystalline. Under moonlight, it gleamed like glass. She pressed it in her palm until it cracked. "You were made from fire," she said softly. "So am I." The next day, rumors moved through the plantation like wind through cane. A whisper about uprisings on another island, St. Lucia maybe. A word passed between workers during meal breaks, freedom. It sounded foreign, almost funny. The overseer noticed the silence growing heavier. He mistook it for obedience. He didn't know silence could be a spark waiting for oxygen. By nightfall, the rum was gone. Kojo stared into the dying coals. "It's close," he murmured. Amara asked, "What is?" He looked up, eyes glowing orange. "The fire that will remember all our names." In the distance, thunder rolled, or maybe drums. No one slept. The mill turned slower that night, as if listening. The air itself trembled. The sea sent wind inland, tasting of salt and warning. The bell rang at dawn, as always, but for the first time, no one moved right away. Hands lingered on machetes, eyes stayed on the horizon. The overseer shouted. His voice cracked like old wood. Amara looked toward the boiling house. The chimney smoked white, pure and steady. She felt heat rise beneath her ribs, the kind that does not burn flesh, but memory. She turned to Kojo. He nodded once. The fire had begun to speak again. The night carried no stars, only embers. Clouds hung low, swollen with the smoke that refused to die. The cane fields whispered, each leaf brushing against another like flint on stone. Amara stood barefoot in the dark, her breath a thin thread between fear and something larger. No one had spoken of plans, yet everyone knew. The silence between them had changed its texture. It was no longer weight, but rhythm. Men sharpened machetes without hiding the sound. Women filled jugs with water that would never be for drinking. Kojo's shadow stretched long under the moon. He stood near the boiling house, shovel in hand, eyes fixed on the glowing windows. "They keep the fire for themselves," he said. "We'll borrow it for one night." The way he said borrow made the word sound holy. The overseer's voice echoed faintly from the great house. Laughter followed, a drunk laugh, wet and easy. The masters celebrated sugar shipments that had sailed that morning, barrels of sweetness crossing the ocean while the island's hands bled in darkness. Inside the barracks, a child coughed. The sound traveled through the wood like a spark through dry straw. Amara looked down at her palms, still scarred, still trembling. She remembered her husband's scream swallowed by steam. Her heartbeat began to count like a drum. Kojo began humming, A tune older than the plantation, low and deep, the sound of earth remembering. One by one, others joined. Their voices had no words, just a pulse. Even the crickets paused to listen. They moved in small groups through the field. Each held something that could start a flame, an oil-soaked rag, a handful of coal, a shard of mirror to catch the moonlight. The air smelled like waiting. When they reached the boiling house, Amara stopped. The great iron vats glowed faintly from within, syrup still bubbling. She touched the brick wall, warm, breathing. The fire inside seemed to answer. "Not yet," she whispered. "Soon." From the ridge, the sea was a dark sheet, restless. Lightning flared somewhere far off where water met horizon. Kojo turned his face toward it. "That's the sea's drum," he said. "It's keeping time for us." Midnight arrived quiet. The overseer had passed out, rum still open on his desk. The guards leaned half asleep against their rifles. Only the wind moved freely. Amara knelt by the furnace door, her hands steady now. She slid a rag inside and watched it catch. The flame was small at first, a curious child. Then it grew teeth. The air thickened, the world held its breath. Fire raced along the oil trails like memory finding a voice. Within seconds, the boiling house roared. A sound followed, not a scream, not a shout, but a deep, rising hum. It came from every throat that had ever bent under heat. Men stood upright for the first time in years. Women raised their arms, palms open, catching sparks like blessings. The cane caught next. Dry leaves hissed and curled. Green stalks blackened at their tips. Smoke climbed toward the moon and painted it red. The field became a map of light, veins of gold spreading through darkness. Kojo lifted his shovel like a banner. "No more sweet lies," he shouted. The words broke the night open. Someone else cried, "Let them taste what they made." The chorus grew until even the fire seemed to sing back. Amara watched sugar melt into liquid gold, flowing down the hill like lava. The heat kissed her face, fierce and forgiving. She whispered to herself, "We are the fire now." The great house lights flickered as the masters woke to the smell. Panic replaced perfume. Boots struck stone, orders tangled with prayers. A gun fired somewhere, swallowed instantly by the crackle of cane. The sky glowed orange, the island pulsed. Shadows ran, some chasing, some fleeing, none sure which they were. The sea wind shifted, feeding the blaze until it roared like judgment. Kojo stood beside Amara, sweat shining on his dark skin. "You see?" he said, voice calm amid chaos. "The sugar remembers who cut it." She nodded, eyes fixed on the inferno. Sparks leapt into the air, bursting into stars that would not die. The plantation's heartbeat had changed, still pounding, but this time, it belonged to them. Somewhere beyond the flames, the church bell began to ring, wild and uneven. Whether by wind or hand, no one knew. Its sound folded into the roar, a hymn of ash and defiance. As dawn approached, the fields were nothing but silhouettes of smoke. The horizon glowed as if the sun had risen early to watch. Amara knelt, pressing her palm into the burnt soil. It was warm, alive, breathing through the ash. Kojo touched her shoulder. "We lit the night," he said. "Now we see what burns." Behind them, the mill collapsed, a slow groan turning into dust. In its echo, the first birds sang, soft, cautious, as though unsure if morning had truly come. And in the distance, across the sea, ships waited, carrying sugar, rum, and the illusion of peace, unaware that the sweetness they bore had already turned to smoke. The night of burning sugar was not over. It had simply changed form, carried on the wind, waiting for the next place to burn. The dawn came blood orange, thick with ash. Smoke lay low over Barbados like a second sky. The cane fields were gone, nothing but black ribs of stalks still steaming, their sweetness boiled into ghosts. The island breathed heavy, as if exhausted by remembering. The fire had moved faster than anyone thought possible. It had eaten fences, stables, and prayers alike. Where the boiling houses once stood, pools of melted sugar hardened into amber crusts, sharp and glistening like the surface of broken glass. Amara walked barefoot through the ruin. Each step stuck slightly, the ground still soft with heat. She carried nothing. The air itself was her burden. Hot, sweet, sick. Kojo followed, his hands black with soot, eyes red but unblinking. "We've fed the fire," he said softly. "Now it will feed us." The sky rumbled, not thunder, but the groan of the mills collapsing one by one. In the distance, the great house still burned, its white walls bleeding smoke. The masters had fled toward the coast before sunrise, their carriages leaving tracks like veins through the ash. By mid-morning, the soldiers arrived from Bridgetown, red coats bright as wounds against the blackened fields. Their horses snorted at the smell. "Put it out," the captain barked, though there was nothing left to save. Amara stood at the edge of the road, her face streaked with soot and light. When the soldiers passed, one of them raised his musket. She didn't move. "She's only a woman," another said. The captain spat. "Then shoot her first." The musket cracked, smoke folding into smoke, but the shot went wide, lost in the heat haze. The captain swore and turned away. Amara didn't flinch. She only looked down at her own hands, shaking slightly, not from fear, but from knowing they could no longer be used to pick cane. Kojo placed a hand on her shoulder. "The sea will see this," he said. "It sees everything we burn." He turned toward the horizon where the ocean shimmered through the smoke, gray, endless, indifferent. By noon, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of molasses toward the coast. The fishermen said the sea smelled sweet that day, like it was learning how to remember land. Waves lapped at the shore, thick with soot and bits of cane, black foam rolling like ink over parchment. The soldiers marched inland, arresting anyone who breathed too loud. Chains replaced machetes, and silence became the new fire. But the silence didn't last. In one village, an overseer's house went up in flames again. The soldiers found no one inside. In another, barrels of rum exploded under the sun, spraying gold fire into the air. Each blast was a heartbeat, each echo a promise kept. Amara and Kojo reached the cliffs by nightfall. Below them, the sea glowed faintly red, reflecting the last of the burning island. "It's all gone," she whispered. Kojo shook his head. "Not gone, freed." They sat in the ash, watching waves crash against stone. The wind carried voices from somewhere inland, shouts, hymns, gunfire, maybe thunder. It was hard to tell anymore what was rebellion and what was weather. Kojo lifted a handful of black soil and let it fall between his fingers. "This was sweetness once," he said. "Now it's memory." Amara looked out at the sea. "Maybe the sea will taste it," she said. For a long time, they said nothing. Only the crackle of distant fires filled the silence. Then, Kojo began humming again, the same tune as before, slower now, heavier. Amara joined, her voice low and rough. The sound rolled across the cliffs like a tide. A ship appeared in the distance, a dark silhouette moving without sails. It glided through the smoke as if carved from the same fire that had devoured the land. The soldiers in Bridgetown later claimed they saw it too. Some said it was a warship. Others said it was the sea itself come to take back what was stolen. Amara watched it until it vanished behind the mist. "Do you think it's ours?" she asked. Kojo smiled faintly. "If not yet, it will be." When night fell, the island was silent. The fires had burned themselves to sleep. The soldiers camped near the ruins, too tired to chase ghosts. The air cooled, and the smell of sugar faded into salt. Amara lay beside the cliff, her eyes half closed. The stars looked like sparks floating above the ocean's surface. Somewhere below, the waves beat slow and steady. 3 times, then silence. She whispered, "Even the sea has learned our rhythm." Kojo nodded, staring into the dark. "Aye, and it will remember longer than they ever will." Behind them, a single stalk of unburned cane swayed in the wind, thin and trembling, but still green. It caught the faint glow of the moon and bent forward, as if bowing to the ashes below. The island slept that night, but the fire did not. It had simply gone underground, into stories, into songs, into the memory of the sea that had watched it all. And when dawn came again, it rose not from the east, but from the west, reflected in the ocean, red and unbroken. Morning returned like an unwanted guest. The wind had shifted, carrying ash over Bridgetown. The governor's mansion stank of sugar and fear. Clerks coughed as they wrote, ink mixing with soot. Every newspaper called it the rebellion of the fields. None wrote the word freedom. The survivors, those who hadn't fled or been shot, were herded into the square. Their skin shone with sweat and soot, their wrists bound by iron that still smelled of the forge. Amara stood among them, her eyes calm. Kojo beside her held his head high, though blood dried along his neck. The soldiers avoided his gaze. It was easier to hate what you never looked at. The judge read names that weren't names, half remembered, half invented. Each one ended with the same sentence, to hang by the neck until dead. The crowd nodded, eager for order to return. Order meant sugar, sugar meant wealth, wealth meant forgetting. Amara's name came last. Guilty of arson, insurrection, and sedition, the clerk said, his voice flat. She said nothing. What defense could exist against truth spoken by flame? The judge asked, "Do you understand your crimes?" She replied, "Do you understand mine?" The court went silent. Kojo laughed softly. "They burn us for burning what burned us," he whispered. The guard struck him across the face, but the laughter didn't stop. It grew, rippling through the prisoners, small and low, until even the soldiers shifted uneasily. In the gallery, the planters whispered among themselves. "They've lost their minds," one said. "No," another muttered. "They've found them." Outside, smoke still drifted from the hills, curling like handwriting in the sky. By afternoon, the first executions began. The gallows creaked as if in protest. The rope swung in rhythm with the wind, a grim pendulum marking the empire's heartbeat. But the crowd did not cheer. The silence felt too heavy, like smoke pressed against glass. When Kojo's turn came, he looked out at the sea. The horizon shimmered, pale and endless. "You can't hang fire," he said quietly. "It learns to walk." The hangman hesitated before pulling the lever. The rope snapped tight. The sound was final, but the air didn't clear. Amara watched, her lips moving soundlessly. The judge mistook it for prayer. It wasn't. It was a promise. That night, rain came hard, washing ash through the streets, turning gutters into black rivers. The fires died completely, but the smell lingered, sweet, cloying, unforgettable. Some said it was sugar still burning underground. Others said it was the island breathing through its wounds. In the barracks where prisoners had waited, the walls glistened with moisture. Amara sat alone, tracing the cracks in the wood with her fingertip. She thought of the fields before the fire, the hiss of cane in the wind. It had sounded like whispering then. Now it was memory. A guard entered, drunk on rum. "Tomorrow you hang," he said. His words slurred into the air like flies. Amara looked at him, unblinking. "Tomorrow," she said, "the sea will rise higher." He laughed, uneasy. "You think the sea cares?" She smiled. "It always has. It just waits for its turn." When dawn broke, the gallows stood wet and black. The crowd gathered again, smaller this time, tired, unsure what to believe. The governor himself watched from his balcony, his handkerchief pressed to his mouth against the stench. They led Amara up the steps. Her feet left dark prints on the wood. The priest offered a final prayer. She ignored it. Her eyes were fixed on the harbor, where the tide moved strangely, pulling farther back than it should. The hangman asked if she had last words. She said, "Fire falls, water rises, both remember." The rope tightened, the lever fell. The same moment, the earth trembled. A low, deep sound rolled from the coast, a roar too slow to be thunder. People screamed as the sea rushed back in, higher, louder, dragging barrels, carts, and soldiers alike. The gallows shook, then splintered. Salt water surged through the square, washing blood and ash into one gray flood. The bodies swung for a heartbeat longer, then vanished beneath the tide. The judge's papers scattered into the wind, ink bleeding into rain. When the water receded, the square was empty. No gallows, no bodies, only a layer of black sand left behind, smooth and shining in the morning light. The soldiers searched the shoreline for days. They found Kojo's shovel, half buried in mud, and one iron shackle fused shut by heat. They never found Amara. Some said the sea took her, others whispered she walked out with it. Weeks later, sailors reported strange tides, warm currents that smelled faintly of burnt sugar, glowing red under moonlight. Fishermen refused to cast their nets near the coast. "The sea's still cooking," they said. In Bridgetown, the plantations began rebuilding. The mills turned again, slower, cautious. But every time the gears groaned, they sounded like a woman's voice, low, steady, unending. And sometimes, when the wind blew from the west, the scent of molasses carried across the island, sweet, thick, and heavy with warning. The governor wrote to London, "The rebellion is over." But the sea outside his window whispered otherwise, because fire dies and water forgets nothing. Months passed. The island healed on paper, not in truth. Reports to London spoke of restored order, repaired mills, and renewed productivity. The governor's seal gleamed red at the bottom of every lie, but in the fields the soil had turned dark and sullen. Nothing grew where the fire had walked. The cane sprouted thin, its sweetness gone bitter. They rebuilt the boiling houses with imported bricks. The chimneys rose again, proud as if they had never known collapse. Yet each night, workers swore they heard whispers inside the walls, low voices counting, naming, remembering. Some refused to go near after dark. "It's just the wind," the overseers said. The wind had learned to sound like ghosts. Kojo's name still appeared on the ledgers, crossed out but legible. The overseer used the same page to tally the new workers shipped in from another island, fresh hands, unknowing eyes. They asked where the old ones had gone. No one answered. The answer was all around them. Amara's name, however, was gone completely. No record, no grave, no word. But stories traveled faster than ships. In one village, a fisherman swore he saw a woman walking along the shallows, her dress the color of smoke. Another said he found footprints in the wet sand, bare, delicate, leading toward the sea, never returning. The British soldiers stationed on the island joked about it at first. The sugar witch, they called her. She comes when the barrels turn sour. But the joke stopped when the first shipment spoiled mid-voyage. The rum curdled. The sugar clumped like black resin. The sailors said the ocean around their ship hissed at night like boiling water. The plantation owners blamed humidity, superstition, anything but history. They burned incense, hired priests, built new crosses over the fields. Still, every harvest ended the same. Half yield, full silence. At the rebuilt mill, a new foreman noticed something odd. The gears, once steady, now skipped once every hour, a single lurch that sounded almost like a heartbeat. "Old iron," he muttered, but every time the wheel turned, the air tasted faintly of smoke and salt. Children born after the rebellion grew up on the smell of ash and honey. They played among blackened stumps and called them the forest of fire. When they cut the cane, their blades struck flint, sending sparks into daylight. None of them knew the full story, but they knew to whisper thanks before entering the field. The priests preached forgiveness. "Let the past burn away," they said. But at night, when the torches flickered, some swore they saw faces in the flames, men and women made of light, eyes open, unblinking. In the governor's mansion, the grand piano was played again. Music floated across the veranda, soft and elegant, yet sometimes between notes, a faint hum rose from beneath the floorboards, the sound of distant voices keeping time. The governor's wife complained of a molasses smell in her sleep. He ordered the floors scrubbed with lye. The smell returned every morning. One evening, a storm came in sudden from the east. Rain hammered the island, fierce and rhythmic. Lightning struck the old gallows square. When dawn came, the spot was gone. Washed clean, the sand below black as ink. By then, no one spoke Amara's name aloud. But every harvest season, someone left a small bowl of sugar by the sea. Some said it was superstition. Others said it kept the tides calm. The ocean never returned it. In the rebuilt chapel, a young priest found a single page of burnt paper tucked inside the Bible. The ink had run, but one line still clear. "Fire falls, water rises, both remember." He asked who wrote it. No one knew. The handwriting was feminine, strong, steady. Years later, when the price of sugar collapsed and the British Parliament debated emancipation, merchants in London complained of strange correspondence from the Indies. Letters arrived smelling of brine and soot. Some were blank, others contained one word: return. The island began to change again. Winds came heavier from the west, and the sea crept farther inland each year. Fishermen said the water had grown darker, its waves thicker. The scientists called it tide shift. The elders called it justice. One night, long after the last plantation bell had fallen silent, a ship anchored off the coast, new, white-sailed, proud. By morning, it was gone. No wreckage, no survivors, only a slick film on the water, sweet and black, like syrup spilled over the waves. The newspapers said nothing. But in the villages, people whispered that the ocean had taken its payment at last. At dawn, a woman was seen standing on the cliff watching the horizon. Her hair lifted with the wind, her eyes bright with the color of fire. When the first light touched her face, she stepped forward, and the sea rose to meet her. No one on the island dared to follow, but when they looked again, the tide had gone calm, and the air smelled of burnt sugar and salt. That morning, every worker who went into the field found their machetes clean, their scars pale. The overseer couldn't explain it. He only knew that when he called the first bell, no one moved until the second. The rhythm had changed, and somewhere beneath the soil, warm and patient, something old turned over once more, half fire, half water, fully awake. The cane would grow again, but now it would remember who cut it. The year the empire called the island recovered, the sea stopped whispering and began to hum, low, steady, endless. It rattled windows in the governor's mansion, shook sugar barrels in the docks, and rolled through the sleeping villages like a breath too deep to be ignored. At first, the people said it was just wind. Then they noticed the water, blacker than night, thick as syrup, rippling in perfect rhythm with the church bells that hadn't rung in months. Fishermen who cast their nets returned empty. Those who didn't return at all were said to have gone sweet, swallowed by the sea that remembered. By then, no one spoke of rebellion. The English newspapers called it the disturbance of 1816, but the island knew another name, the burning year. The elders told their children, "We were sugar once, then we melted." And when the children laughed, they told them to listen closer to the wind. It still carried the sound of boiling. The new overseer kept records in fine ink. He wrote of profits, of yield, of progress. Yet every page warped in the humidity, curling inward like paper too close to flame. At night, his servants found him staring at the horizon, mumbling, "The light won't stay where it's supposed to." In the rebuilt chapel, the priest tried to lead hymns, but his voice broke on the word deliverance. The candles burned blue, and one refused to go out even after being snuffed. "It's the air," he said, "too rich with smoke." No one corrected him. One morning before sunrise, a strange stillness fell over the island. The waves stopped moving. Even the insects went silent. Workers paused mid-step, machetes hanging in the air. From the direction of the sea came a single sound, a crack, deep and deliberate, like the earth remembering something it had buried. The tide began to glow, not with sunlight, but with a dull red fire that moved beneath the surface, slow and pulsing. It rolled toward the shore without foam, without sound, until it lapped against the sand. Where it touched, the black earth shimmered gold. The first to see it was a child. He ran home shouting, "The sugar's coming back!" His mother dragged him inside, shut the door, and whispered, "No, child, that's not sugar. That's what we owed." By noon, the glow had reached the docks. Barrels leaked without reason. Ships moored in the harbor creaked and groaned as though sighing. The sailors smelled molasses in the air, thick and warm. One muttered, "The sea's cooking again." In the marketplace, old Kojo's shovel, hung above a tavern door as a curiosity of rebellion, fell from its hook. When it struck the floor, it rang like metal in a forge. The owner swore the sound went on for minutes. That night, thunder rolled, but no lightning came. The sea's hum deepened, echoing through every hollow bone and half-broken memory on the island. The governor ordered cannon fire to scare away the superstition. The iron balls sank into the glowing waves and vanished without splash. The soldiers waited for them to rise. They never did. Then the rain began, not clear, but amber. Thick droplets fell slowly, staining everything they touched. It smelled of sugarcane and smoke, of something too familiar to be holy. People opened their hands to the sky and watched the gold traces spread across their palms like veins. Amara's story had long become myth by then. Some said she burned. Some said she became the fire. But the old women in the hills whispered another truth, that she walked into the sea to cool it, and that every wave since was her breath. In the sugar fields, where the earth had once refused to grow, green shoots rose overnight, tall, straight, gleaming faintly even in darkness. But when the overseer's men cut them, the stalks bled a thin red sap. Sweet, salted, alive. He ordered them burned again. The fire refused to take. The flames bent away from the cane, curling like smoke denied air. The workers dropped their torches and fled. Only the wind answered them, whispering in the same rhythm as the sea. Fire falls, water rises, both remember. The governor died that night, found slumped over his desk. The servants said he'd drowned. though his lungs were full of nothing but steam. The ink on his final report had run into a single dark stain. Weeks later, the Empire sent a ship to investigate. It never returned. The fishermen claimed the horizon swallowed it whole. On clear nights, they said, you could still see its sails beneath the waves, burning gold in the dark, turning slowly, endlessly. Generations passed. The island changed hands, flags, names. Tourists came for the beaches and the rum. They said the sunsets here were the color of caramel. None asked what had been burned to make it so beautiful. But when the tide is low and the air is still, the old people still go down to the shore. They place a pinch of sugar in the sand, watch the waves take it, and whisper, "We remember." Then they turn away before the sea whispers back. Because some debts were paid in fire and some in silence, and Barbados learned to live with both. Fire made them slaves, but it also made them free. Every sweetness we taste is borrowed from their ashes. And that is how the sugar still burns, quietly, endlessly, beneath the sea. The London fog that winter was thick enough to chew. It swallowed the street lamps whole and left the air tasting of coal and iron. Clerks hurried through the gray morning with collars up, boots slick with soot, each carrying letters stamped from the colonies. Inside those envelopes were ghosts written in neat ink. At the General Post Office, the sorting room smelled strange, not of paper or wax, but of burnt sweetness. The clerk on duty, Mr. Penrose, rubbed his fingers after touching one of the Barbados letters. The paper was warm. The seal had melted slightly, as if someone had held it too close to a flame. He passed it to his superior, who laughed it off. "These islanders can't even keep a candle straight," he said. But when he slit the wax, a puff of smoke rose, gray and fine. The words inside were legible but blurred at the edges, as though the ink refused to stay still. "Production decreased. Fields remain ash. The slaves, those that live, refuse to sing. The air itself smells of boiling." By noon, a rumor had begun to crawl through Whitehall that the mail from the Caribbean carried the fever of fire. No one dared burn the letters. The last time someone tried, the flame had gone blue and refused to die. A young member of Parliament named Jonathan Merrick first heard of it through a journalist friend. He was 28, idealistic, and foolish enough to believe truth could still be legislated. He requested access to the Colonial correspondence. The archivist laughed, coughed, and handed him a stack that smelled faintly of caramelized air. The first letter he opened wasn't dated, only marked with a single phrase. "The sugar remembers." The handwriting was elegant, almost feminine. The paper, though brittle, left a brown stain on his fingertips like dried syrup. When he lifted it to his nose, the scent was unmistakable: burnt cane and sea salt. Merrick read through hundreds more. Reports of idle laborers, damaged crops, and strange chemical mists that blackened the mills. One overseer wrote that his workers refused to touch the boiling vats, claiming they screamed when stirred. Another letter described a phenomenon no one dared print: the sound of drumming heard through the factory walls, though no drums were present. Perhaps the machinery, the writer suggested, or the wind. Merrick underlined the word wind. He'd read similar notes in the Jamaican dispatches, talk of whispers in the cane, of lights over the sea. He began to suspect the colonies weren't sending reports, they were sending warnings. That night, he brought the papers home to his flat near Westminster. His housekeeper scolded him for working so late. "The ink's gone bad," she said, wiping her hands. "Smells like it wants to burn." At midnight, Merrick noticed smoke rising from his desk. Not from the candle, from the letters themselves. He touched one. It was cold, yet the writing shimmered, lines glowing faintly red as if lit from beneath. He read aloud. "Those who harvest heat shall one day breathe it." The letters trembled. For a moment, he thought he heard boiling, slow, deliberate, like something cooking under his floorboards. Then, silence. The smoke vanished. The next morning, the windows of his study were streaked with brown residue. When he scraped it, it tasted sweet. At Parliament, Merrick tried to raise the issue. He spoke of unrest, of hidden famine, of something spreading across the colonies that no cannon could extinguish. His fellow members smiled politely, adjusted their wigs, and said, "The sun never sets on the empire." That night, his journalist friend published an article titled "The Letters That Smoked." It described how the empire's correspondence from Barbados arrived warm to the touch, carrying the scent of scorched sugar. The story caused laughter in the coffee houses until one of them caught fire. The flames burned red, not orange, and the wood refused to blacken. The next day, the newspapers printed nothing. The presses were said to have jammed, the ink congealing like molasses. Merrick visited the print shop and saw for himself, the rollers coated in a glossy brown sheen that smelled of sweetness and salt. 3 nights later, he received a final letter. No seal, no return address, just his name written in a trembling hand. Inside, one line: London will learn what it means to taste its own smoke. He laughed nervously, folded the paper, and placed it in the fire. The flame hissed, blue, then black. The hearth filled with the smell of sugar cooking too long. When he woke the next morning, the letter was gone. But the inside of the fireplace shone faintly gold, as though lined with crystallized light. Weeks passed. Then, months. Merrick stopped receiving mail altogether. The postal clerk said it wasn't that letters weren't being sent, it was that they wouldn't arrive. Ships reported sacks of correspondence bursting into flame mid-voyage, sealed tight in their holds. In Barbados, they said the wind had shifted, blowing east across the sea, toward London. And one foggy morning, when the bells of St. Paul's tolled through the smog, a clerk opening the day's post found a single envelope sitting on his desk. No stamp, no seal. When he lifted it, his fingers came away dusted with sugar. He didn't open it, because it was still warm. Empires write their history in ink, but the truth always answers in smoke. From the unsent journal of Jonathan Merrick, 1817. When the bells of Westminster rang that August, the newspapers called it the dawn of freedom. Slavery, they said, was over. The empire congratulated itself in headlines of polished gold ink. The same ships that once carried chains now carried certificates of emancipation, stamped, sealed, and heavy with sugar dust. London wanted to celebrate. It always did. So the merchants proposed a grand exhibition at Somerset House. The Museum of Sweetness, Industry, Civilization, and the Triumph of British Progress. They built it fast, columns white as bone, banners silk red like boiled syrup. The first hall smelled faintly of roses and ash. Visitors queued in their finest hats, coins jingling beside moral pride. Inside, behind glass, they displayed everything the colonies had cost. Models of sugar mills carved from ivory. Paintings of happy laborers smiling under eternal blue skies. A lump of pure cane pressed into crystal and labeled the sweet reward of labor. Children laughed, ministers praised, the empire applauded itself for being merciful. But in the corner of the second hall stood something the curators hadn't planned for. It was a block of sugar the size of a coffin, dark, almost black. No one knew who had sent it. The crate had arrived with no papers, only a label scorched into the wood. Barbados. The attendants tried to polish its surface, but every cloth came away brown. They said the lump was sweating, beads of moisture rolling down its sides like tears. By evening, the hall smelled of burnt molasses and seawater. A clergyman joked that it was the devil's dessert. No one laughed. They roped it off and hung a plaque, specimen of unrefined sugar, Colonial type. By the second week, visitors noticed something stranger. The block never stopped steaming, faintly, like a breath. It left a thin mist that curled upward and stuck to the glass ceiling, dimming the chandeliers. One journalist wrote, "The exhibit exhales. I stood close enough to hear it crack, as though a fire lived quietly inside." The director demanded it be moved to storage, but when workers tried to lift it, the floorboards creaked, and one man swore the sugar groaned. Another claimed he heard humming, low, rhythmic, like chains in water. That night, the museum watchman sat in his chair, nodding off beside the dark cube. He dreamed of a field burning under moonlight. The air was thick with ash, and voices whispered through the smoke. "We sweetened their tongues, now let them taste the fire." He woke to find the room glowing faint red. The block pulsed faintly, as if alive. He touched his cross, muttered a prayer, and fled. In the morning, the directors found him outside, barefoot, sugar crystals stuck to his skin like frost. He couldn't speak, only whispered one word: warm. They closed that wing of the museum for fumigation. The papers printed polite silence. But the rumor spread faster than the exhibitions themselves, that something in the sugar still remembered Barbados. Months later, the museum reopened. The black cube had vanished. In its place stood a marble statue, Britannia offering light to the colonies. No one mentioned the missing exhibit, but every now and then, when the gas lamps flickered, visitors claimed they smelled caramel burning, faint, distant, and sorrowful. In the basement, the curator's apprentice kept a diary. One entry survived. They told me the sugar was gone, but when I walk past the cellar door, I hear dripping, slow and steady. The puddle never dries. I think it's still melting its way home. The empire had built a monument to sweetness, but sweetness had its own memory, and it refused to stay still. The Museum of Sweetness was never closed officially, only sealed, and the air inside still tastes of burnt sugar. At first, they thought it was rust. Then someone tasted it. The River Thames, the empire's gray artery, had turned the color of syrup. Thick streaks ran through the current like veins under old skin. Bargemen complained that their oars stuck in the water. Fishermen said their nets came up glazed. By noon, the city smelled faintly of caramel. By dusk, it smelled like history trying to cook itself clean. The newspapers called it a phenomenon of decay. Parliament called it a natural occurrence, but the dock workers called it what it was, the sugar flood. They said it began near the West India docks, where ships carrying molasses once unloaded under armed guard. Those warehouses had been empty since abolition, or so the ledgers claimed. Now, every tide brought something new. Bubbles rising thick as breath, ropes floating upward as if dragged from below, and once, only once, a barrel that split open to reveal nothing but dark foam that smelled of smoke and seawater. A man named Dr. Henry Blackwell, chemist of the Royal Society, was sent to investigate. He arrived with vials, instruments, and confidence. He dipped a flask into the river and swirled it under his nose. His smile faltered. "It's sugar," he whispered, "raw, unrefined, but burnt." The others laughed. He didn't. When he heated a drop of the river's water over flame, it didn't bubble. It hissed as though angry. Then, faintly, came a sound none could explain, a rhythm, deep and deliberate, like a heartbeat or the thud of distant oars. "Condensation," someone said. But no one spoke again after the second thud. That night, Dr. Blackwell took samples home. His wife complained that the house smelled strange, sweet, and metallic. He locked himself in his study and boiled the water until only crystals remained. They were brown and warm. He left them on the windowsill. By morning, they were gone, replaced by small puddles that shaped themselves into circles, perfect and trembling. In his notebook, he wrote, "Sugar that refuses solid form, memory in liquid state. Perhaps the ocean carries more than salt." Then, in smaller letters beneath it, "When heated, the sample hums." At the docks, the water began to rise higher with each tide. The stains crept up the wooden pylons, leaving behind sticky streaks that glowed faintly under moonlight. The bargemen stopped working at night. They said they saw shapes under the surface, not fish, not driftwood, but ropes moving of their own accord. The overseer laughed. "The tide's just turning." But the old sailors shook their heads. "No," they said, "it's returning." In Westminster, the Lord Mayor ordered the matter silenced. Trade could not afford superstition. He commissioned the draining of a section near Tower Bridge. The engineers lowered pumps into the muck and stopped when they hit something solid. A plank of wood, blackened but intact, carved into it, barely legible, "Return." The workers refused to touch it. They said the plank was warm. One man dropped his glove on it and swore he heard singing from under the water, low, rhythmic, and slow, like the sound of a hull creaking in sleep. When word reached Dr. Blackwell, he went to the docks at once. He found the workers gone, the pumps silent. The plank still lay half submerged. He knelt, brushed his fingers across it, and saw his reflection ripple, not downward, but sideways, as though the water wanted to remember his face. He whispered, "What are you?" The river answered, not with words, but with a pulse. 3 beats, then silence. That night, the Thames boiled. No one saw it happen. But in the morning, the air smelled of burnt sugar again, and a fine brown mist hung over the bridges. Children ran their fingers along the railings and licked them out of curiosity. The taste was sweet and warm. A preacher standing by St. Paul's said it was the judgment of God. An old woman selling fish said, "No, it's the sea remembering what it lost." In his final report, Dr. Blackwell wrote, "This is not water. This is recollection. Every empire that sweetens its tongue must one day taste its own river. The Thames flows brown not from filth, but from memory." He sealed the letter, addressed it to the Royal Society, and burned it before posting. The next day, his neighbors found his house empty, the study door open, and a thin trail of syrup leading out toward the pier. No one ever saw him again. Weeks later, bargemen claimed that under certain dawns, they could see a faint shape beneath the surface, a hull black as coal, moving without tide or crew. When it passed, the river thickened and the bridges trembled. They began to call it what the sailors in Barbados once whispered, the return. Every empire leaves a sweetness behind, and every sweetness in time burns. The sugar fires were long gone, or so the city claimed. London had rebuilt its docks with iron cranes and gaslight, the empire's proud veins pumping again with tea, timber, and tobacco. But in the mornings, before sunrise, when fog still clung to the Thames like wet cloth, there was always a sound. 3 beats, then silence, then again. The merchants said it was machinery. The dock workers said nothing at all. The first to lose his voice was Thomas Hale, a man built like the barges he unloaded. His wife said he came home one night with his throat blistered, though he hadn't been near a flame. "It's the steam," the doctor said. "The air down there's poison." But Thomas wrote his wife a note before sleep. "It's not the steam, it's the singing." By morning, he was gone. His boots still stood by the door, damp and lined with sugar crystals. 2 more men vanished that week. One was found by the river's edge, his mouth open, his tongue blackened like burnt cane. The other was never found at all, only his coat heavy with molasses. Rumor spread through the docks faster than cargo. They said the choir had begun. At night, when the tide rolled in, the workers heard humming, low, rhythmic, without words. Some said it came from beneath the water, others said it came from inside them. No one dared whistle anymore. Even the taverns went quiet. The pianists refused to play, claiming their instruments remembered the sound. One man who tried to sing was struck dumb mid-verse, his lips still forming the word home. Inspector Edwin Lark, newly transferred from Whitechapel, was assigned to investigate. He was a practical man, allergic to mystery, armed only with notebooks and disbelief. He interviewed the dock workers, but none would speak above a whisper. He noted, eyes wide, pulse steady, all refused to vocalize, as if the act itself were dangerous. That night, he stayed by the water after curfew. The fog was thick, yellow-white under gaslight. He listened. At first, nothing. Then, faint and steady, came the sound of footsteps. Dozens of them, but the docks were empty. The planks trembled under a rhythm too perfect for chance. 3 steps, pause, 3 steps, pause. When he called out, his voice fell flat, swallowed by something heavy in the air. Then he heard it, humming, not melody, not language, just breath, moving together, vast and human. He wrote later. It sounded like a choir rehearsing beneath the river. By dawn, he found the footprints, dozens of them pressed into the mud, bare and wet. They led to the edge of the pier and stopped. No splash marks, no drag lines, just absence. In Parliament, the dock authorities demanded silence. "Superstition kills productivity," one lord declared. They replaced half the workers with new hires from the countryside, men who didn't yet know what the river could do. By the second week, they knew. They didn't vanish. They simply stopped speaking. Their throats remained uninjured, but when they opened their mouths, only steam escaped, faint, smelling of burnt sugar. The overseer panicked. He summoned a priest. The priest blessed the docks, sprinkled holy water, and left pale as chalk. He refused to return, saying only, "They're not possessed, they're remembering." That winter, the fog thickened. The Thames rose higher than it had in years, as though something beneath it was breathing too deeply. Barges began to drift without oars. Ships moored at night were found miles downstream by morning. From the bridges, citizens swore they heard singing when the bells struck midnight, always 3 notes, long and low, always ending in silence. Some said it sounded like mourning. Others said it sounded like marching. Inspector Lark wrote one last report before resigning. "The men by the river do not speak, but their silence moves like tide. When they walk, they step in unison, 3 beats, then still. I counted 47 of them last night, moving in fog. None carried lamps, none looked up. When I followed, they turned toward me as one. I could not see their faces, only their breath glowing faintly red." He mailed the report to Scotland Yard. 2 days later, he drowned himself in the river. By spring, the docks worked themselves. Cargo moved, ropes tightened, cranes turned. No one saw who did it. The overseers stopped asking questions. They just signed manifests and pretended not to hear the faint humming that rose with every shipment of sugar bound east. The newspapers avoided the story. But a pamphlet circulated quietly among laborers, unsigned, written in the same cramped hand as the old slavery's dark past reports. The silent ones are not gone. They are the river now. Every empire that builds on labor must one day hear the rhythm of its own hands. 3 beats. Then silence. When the fog lifted that summer, the water glowed faintly brown again. The merchants called it algae, the workers called it home. And when the bells of St. Paul's rang that evening, London listened, not with ears, but with bones. Because the sound beneath the city was no longer the hum of industry. It was the heartbeat of memory, keeping time. 3 beats, then silence. The choir does not sing for God. It sings for what was buried and what refuses to stay quiet. The city that once sang with looms no longer had a voice. Manchester breathed in soot and coughed out gold, its chimneys standing like the empire's new cathedrals. The bells of St. Anne's rang through a sky the color of steel. Inside the mills, the air shimmered with heat and dust, a storm that never left. The overseers said the women were lucky to work indoors. Civilization, they called it, but the women knew better. Civilization had teeth, and they were caught between them. They fed the spinning frames 12 hours a day, their hair tied back, their voices swallowed by the machine's roar. The only music was rhythm, whir, clack, thud, pause. 3 beats, then silence. No one noticed the change at first. It began with the hum of the looms, a subtle, deliberate syncopation that matched the sound of the Thames those who'd come from London still remembered. A rhythm too human for steel, too ancient for progress. Mechanical fatigue, the engineers said. Lubricate the gears. But when they oiled the frames, the sound only grew clearer, more deliberate, like breath behind the motion. And then the women began to hum along. Her name was Eleanor Shaw, 21, with coal dark hair and a burn scar down her right hand from the dye works. She didn't believe in ghosts, or God, or grace, but she believed in rhythm. It keeps the hands steady, she said, and it listens when no one else does. When the foreman struck a girl for slowing her loom, Eleanor didn't shout. She just stopped working. So did the others. The machines somehow kept moving. The foreman froze. The rhythm continued without them. Whir, clack, thud, pause, steady as breath. He called it witchcraft. She called it practice. That night, the women stayed after hours. They stood between the frames, faces gray with lint, eyes red from strain. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The looms were already speaking, faint, rhythmic, deliberate. 3 beats, then stillness. Eleanor placed her palm on the metal, and the wheel slowed. Beneath the heat, she felt it pulsing, like the heart of something buried and waiting. One girl whispered, "It's the same sound they heard in London." Another said, "Maybe it never left." Eleanor smiled. "Maybe it never will." By morning, the rhythm had spread through the entire factory. Even the youngest workers, the half-timers with soot-streaked faces, moved their feet in time as they carried bobbins. The foreman screamed until his throat broke, but the air swallowed his words. When he struck one of them again, the machines stopped on their own, not jammed, not broken, just still. In the silence that followed, everyone heard it, a faint hum beneath the floorboards, low, steady, human. The foreman backed away. "Who's doing that?" he demanded. Eleanor answered, "The river." That night, fire bloomed. No one knew who lit it, or if it had ever truly been lit at all. It moved too gracefully for chaos, spreading from loom to loom in perfect rhythm, 3 bursts of flame, then a pause, as if keeping time. The women did not run. They stood among the sparks, their faces glowing with reflected orange. The air smelled like molasses and smoke. When the overseers arrived, the building was half ash. The women stood outside in the rain, eyes bright, hands blackened, humming softly, not in grief, but in defiance. The constables called it arson. The papers called it madness, but one witness wrote, "The sound of the burning was musical, 3 crackles, then silence, as though the fire itself was remembering." The trial was short. Eleanor and 12 others were charged with conspiracy to destroy property. When the judge asked her motive, she said, "To make them listen." He replied, "To what?" She answered, "To the rhythm they built their wealth upon." She was sentenced to transport, 7 years in the colonies. But when the ship set sail, sailors swore they heard singing below deck, faint but unmistakable. The sound of looms, of chains, of heartbeat. 3 beats, then silence. Months later, the ruins of the factory were rebuilt, but workers said the new machines never ran right. The gears miscounted, the belt slipped, the iron pulsed with heat even when idle. At night, when the gas lights dimmed, a low hum filled the air. The foreman, a new one now, wrote in the ledger, "Something breathes in the floor." In time, they called it the fire sermon, a myth, a rumor, a ghost story for the working poor. But those who'd lost hands, lungs, and lives in the mills said otherwise. They said the sermon had only one verse. Every machine that runs on silence will one day sing. And when the wind carried the sound through the broken windows, it didn't sound like mourning. It sounded like memory, heavy, human, and unextinguished. 3 beats, then silence. By mid-century, the empire had found a new way to preserve itself: photography. Men who once painted kings now pointed brass lenses at everything that glittered: ships, factories, sugar warehouses, even the dead. Light, they said, does not lie. But in a city built on shadow, light had other plans. The photographer's name was Arthur Penwell, a quiet man with silver hands and lungs full of mercury fumes. He had worked in daguerreotypes since their arrival from France, selling portraits to merchants who wanted their names to outlive their faces. He called his studio Penwell's Memory Works. One morning, a stranger visited, a woman in mourning black, her voice low, her accent neither rich nor poor. "I need a picture," she said. "Of whom?" asked Penwell. She smiled faintly. "Of what remains." She handed him a sealed envelope containing an address: Ancoats Mill, Manchester, burned 1848. He hesitated. "That place is ash." "Exactly," she replied. "Ash remembers." 2 days later, he arrived at the ruins. The air still smelled faintly of molasses, though 5 years had passed. The brick walls stood like broken teeth, and the floor was dusted in white fibers, remnants of cotton that refused to rot. He unpacked his camera, set up the tripod, and opened the lens to the gray winter light. The fog rolled in thick, muffling sound. No birds, no people, just the echo of his own breath against the brass. He counted aloud as he exposed the plate. 1, 2, 3. The shutter clicked, and something exhaled. A thin trail of smoke rose from the viewfinder. Penwell stepped back, coughing. The air smelled sweet, like burnt sugar. He thought it was his chemicals overheating, until he saw the smoke drift against the wind, curling toward the ruin's center. He followed. There, in the half-collapsed hall where the looms once stood, he saw shapes, faint, human, motionless. Women, maybe 12 of them, standing in a row, faces turned toward him, eyes open. He blinked, and they were gone. He returned to his studio, trembling. When he developed the plate, the image came out darker than any he had taken before. The smoke that had drifted through the lens was there, but not as haze. It formed figures, 12 women standing amid fire. Their faces were neither joy nor grief. They looked like witnesses. In the corner, barely visible, stood one more shape, a woman holding a spindle, her hand outstretched toward the camera. Beneath her palm, faint letters had appeared in the light itself. 3 beats, then silence. Penwell stared. The words were not etched into the glass. They shimmered as if alive. When he tried to wipe them off, the chemicals hissed. The smell of burnt sugar filled the room again. He locked the photograph in a tin case and sent a copy to the Royal Academy, marked "Phenomenon of Light Distortion." Weeks later, the Academy returned it, sealed with a note. "Destroy this at once. The image emits gas." But he didn't destroy it. He kept it in his studio, wrapped in cloth, hidden behind portraits of officers and brides. Sometimes, when he developed other plates, the same haze appeared again, the same faint outlines of faces, the same rhythm burned into light. That spring, the newspapers began printing advertisements for a new exhibit, The Progress of Industry, illustrated by modern photography. Arthur was invited to submit a piece. He hesitated, then sent the photograph. He called it simply The Factory Fire. On opening night, the guests arrived in silk and brass buttons. They laughed, drank, and admired the gleaming images of empire, railways, machines, iron bridges. Then they came to his plate. At first, they saw nothing, only a dark blur. Then, under the gaslight, faces began to emerge, women, dozens. Behind them, the faint flicker of flames that seemed to move as the light changed. The crowd gasped. One woman fainted. Another swore she smelled sugar. Within minutes, the gallery filled with smoke. They evacuated the hall, blaming a broken lamp. But when the firemen arrived, they found no flames, only haze that rose from the photograph itself, curling into the air like breath. The curator ordered the plate removed. When the assistant reached for it, he burned his fingers. The glass was warm. By dawn, the photograph had vanished. Arthur Penwell was questioned, but no one could prove arson. His studio was closed by order of the police. When they searched his rooms, they found only one thing on his desk, a note written in silver nitrate and blood. "Light remembers what hands forget. The river has learned to burn without flame." Months later, the fog over London thickened again, smelling faintly of caramel. In the reflection of the shop windows, people swore they saw women standing in rows, their faces calm, their eyes alight. The newspapers called it optical panic. The workers called it recognition. Years passed, cameras evolved, new processes, clearer images, faster exposure. But every photographer knew the rule whispered in darkrooms across the empire. Never count to 3 when you open the shutter. Because sometimes, if you did, the plate would breathe. And in the faint hiss of the chemicals, you could almost hear it. 3 beats, then silence. Light doesn't lie, it remembers. History had learned to pose by then. It stood behind glass, framed and labeled, with captions that smelled of victory. "Empire," the banner said, "is progress captured." The Imperial Archive of Modern Achievement opened that April under a sky the color of old brass. Every photograph glimmered like a sermon. Inside the grand hall of marble and steel, the air hummed with electricity and pride. Students in uniform carried notebooks. Diplomats shook hands under chandeliers. A jazz quartet played near the entrance, their horns polished bright as metals. Cameras flashed. The empire was ready for its close-ups. Among the displays was a small, easily missed exhibit tucked behind a column. Colonial industry, from sugar to steel. 12 photographs, anonymous, unlabeled, rescued from the Royal Academy's archives. No one remembered who took them. One showed a field of cane, shadows bending like bent backs. Another, a mill engulfed in smoke. The 12th was darker, almost black except for faint outlines of women standing in rows, faces turned toward the light. The curator had titled it Untitled, Recovered Plate C. 1850. On opening night, a warm front rolled in from the Atlantic. The city felt heavier, as though breathing through syrup. The electricians blamed humidity when the lights flickered. The orchestra slowed, unaware their rhythm matched something older. 3 beats, then silence. Guests wandered the exhibits, wine glasses trembling slightly with each pulse of the air. At 8:47 p.m., the first frame cracked, a sound like ice breaking in spring. The curator frowned, assuming some child had knocked against the glass. But the crack spread, not outward, downward, like a vein of molten silver crawling through the photograph. Within seconds, the image began to move. The crowd gathered close. The faces inside the photo seemed to shift, eyes widening, mouths parting. A faint steam rose between frame and glass. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else whispered, "It's the heat." But the room wasn't hot, it was breathing. The chandeliers trembled. The glass from the other frames began to fog, droplets forming and running down like sweat. The air smelled faintly of sugar, burnt, metallic, sweet. A journalist near the back raised his camera to capture the moment. The bulb flashed and exploded. The photograph inside the frame shimmered, colors deepening, figures stepping forward into something that looked like flame. Then came the sound. Low, rhythmic, unmistakable, 3 beats, then silence. It rolled through the hall like thunder beneath the floorboards. The quartet stopped playing. The guests froze. The curator whispered, "Turn off the lights." They did, and in the darkness every photograph glowed. The heat came next, not sharp, not violent, a slow rising warmth that felt like standing too close to a memory. The glass in the frames began to soften, bending, dripping like syrup down the marble walls. The curator screamed for water. The guards grabbed buckets, but when they threw it, the liquid hissed and evaporated mid-air, turning into steam that hung in shapes almost human. One woman said she saw hands in the vapor. Another said she heard humming. By the time the fire brigade arrived, the entire west wing had collapsed inward. The marble floor was covered in a thin layer of translucent amber. Inside it, faint outlines, camera tripods, shoes, frames, all fossilized as if captured in sap. No flames, no corpses, just warmth and silence. The official report called it a freak chemical reaction caused by nitrate vapors. The newspapers printed headlines about imperial misfortune, but the technicians who cleaned the rubble told another story. They said that when the lights went out, they felt a pulse through the ground, steady, patient, human. They said they heard whispering, not words but rhythm, and that as they shoveled the melted glass, it clung to their gloves like honey. When one of them peeled it off, he found 3 small burn marks on his palm, round, perfect, evenly spaced. Weeks later, the surviving photographs were cataloged for restoration. Only one remained intact. It showed the same 12 women standing in smoke, eyes half closed. On the back of the print, written in ash, "We are still developing." In the following months, strange reports surfaced across London. Glass darkroom plates refused to dry. Negatives hissed under red light, and every time someone tried to photograph the Thames at night, the image came out tinted brown. A scientist at King's College ran spectral analysis on one of the melted frames. Result: organic carbon residue, consistent with human breath. He filed the report and resigned the next morning. By autumn, the building had been rebuilt and renamed the Gallery of Modern Vision. But on humid days, the marble walls still bled faint amber veins. Visitors said the air inside felt warm, almost alive. And in the echo of their footsteps, curators swore they could still hear it, soft even, defiant. 3 beats, then silence. Light once burned, now it bleeds. Every photograph is a wound pretending to heal. Every empire melts under its own reflection. The drones saw it first. A pattern, faint and circular, appearing in the middle of the Caribbean Trench, a pulse that kept time with nothing on the planet. Every 17 seconds, a tremor, too soft for seismographs, too regular for chance. The research vessel Orpheus 9, belonging to the Global Oceanic Institute, logged it as biothermal anomaly. The scientists on board joked that the sea had learned jazz, but as the readings continued, their laughter thinned. 3 beats, then silence, over and over again. Dr. Amara K., marine acoustician, stared at the sonar printout for hours. "It's not tectonic," she said. "Then what is it?" her assistant asked. She hesitated. "It sounds like breathing." The others laughed, as scientists do when the data becomes too human. But that night, she stayed alone in the monitoring cabin, headphones pressed to her ears. She slowed the playback by half speed. Under the static, a faint pattern emerged, not wail, not current. A low, deliberate pulse, followed by a whisper, too soft for language but unmistakably shaped like intention. She replayed it again. 3 beats, then silence. Her hands trembled. By dawn, she ordered a submersible launch. The ocean was still, unnaturally so, as though waiting to be observed. The small ROV, tethered by cable, descended through blue that turned to green, then black. At 800 meters, visibility vanished. At 900 meters, the instruments flickered. At 1,000, the camera caught movement. Not fish, not wreckage, something vast, curved, and impossibly smooth, like the side of a ship buried in the dark. The operator leaned in. "Hull fragment?" Amara frowned. "No, that's not wood, that's..." The speaker crackled. The sound returned, louder now, resonating through the hull of the submersible itself. 3 low thuds. Then silence. The pilot whispered, "It's answering us." The feed cut. For 6 minutes, they heard nothing. Then, the monitors flashed white, a single image, distorted but clear enough to freeze the room. A ship's prow, black and slick, emerging from silt. No masts, no crew. But beneath its bow, carved deep into metal, one word glowed with faint red light. "Return." The Orpheus 9 tried to surface, but its engines stalled. Every instrument filled with static. The compasses spun. The sonar stopped reading depth. It simply pulsed back in time with the sound. 3 beats, then silence. The captain ordered a full shutdown. The ocean obeyed. The water flattened, mirror smooth, and from below came a low vibration, felt more in the ribs than heard by the ear. It rolled through the hull, through the air, through the lungs of every person aboard. Someone whispered, "It's singing." Dr. K recorded everything. Hours later, when the systems returned, she reviewed the audio. The pulse was still there, constant and alive. But layered beneath it, faint and almost human, were patterns of phonemes repeated over and over. The linguistic AI translated fragments, not gone. Waiting? Walked too deep? She sent the data to the mainland. The Institute dismissed it as hydroacoustic distortion. But when the file was opened at headquarters, the playback melted the speakers. Every recording device that touched the sound warped. Microphones, hard drives, even phones. The sound corrupted everything it entered, leaving behind only rhythm. 3 beats, then silence. 2 weeks later, the Orpheus 9 disappeared. Its transmission. Surface calm, no wind, sea boiling, then static, and one final pulse that shook nearby buoys for miles. Months passed. Fishermen off the coast of Barbados began reporting strange currents. Their nets came up coated in thin brown residue that smelled faintly of sugar. The ministry called it industrial runoff. The locals called it memory. On quiet nights, they said the sea hummed, not loud, just enough to make the boats vibrate, as though the ocean were keeping time. 3 beats, then silence. In London, a curator at the Gallery of Modern Vision received a crate labeled Recovered Artifacts, Orpheus Expedition. Inside were glass fragments, fused smooth by heat. When he held one up to the light, faint shadows moved inside, women in rows, standing still, eyes open. He dropped it. The shard shattered. The air smelled of caramel. Dr. K was never found, but months later, an email arrived in her outbox, unsent, time-stamped from the day of her disappearance. It contained only one sentence: "The sea remembers," and an attached audio file. When played, it was silent for 6 seconds, then came 3 beats, then silence. Satellite thermal imaging later revealed that the area where Orpheus 9 vanished had risen 2 degrees in temperature, forming a perfect ring visible from orbit. At night, the circle glowed faintly red, as if the ocean itself were blushing. Scientists called it biothermal bloom. Poets called it the Empire's scar. Sailors simply said, "The return has come home." Now, every sonar buoy across the Atlantic registers it, the same rhythm echoing miles apart, as if the entire ocean had learned to breathe in unison. 3 beats, then silence. On stormless nights, if you stand by the water and listen closely, the tide seems to whisper, not in anger, not in vengeance, but in patience. It does not ask forgiveness, it only asks to be heard. Because the sea does not forget, it waits. Empires burn, rivers fade, machines rust, but the sea remembers. Every drop is an archive, every wave a witness. History sinks, yes, but nothing that screams ever really drowns. This was slavery's dark past. Subscribe, remember, and let the water speak again.